Well, with that, we'll begin. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for our CMBC lecture from Dr. Krupenye, The Social Minds of Humans and Other Apes. Just to take a couple minutes, this is a lecture that's being presented by the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. If you don't know me, I'm the director, Stout. The center, our mission is to support and foster discussion and so forth across the diverse disciplines at the intersection of mind, brain, and culture. We take this interdisciplinarity very seriously. For instance, our leadership or advisory committee comes from biology, from the business school, from Georgia Tech and Spelman College, from psychology, from mathematics, computer science. So we take this very seriously, including not only the social and biological sciences, the behavioral sciences, the humanities, the arts, and so that's what we exist to do. We try to promote this in various ways, such as lectures like this, smaller discussion lunches. We support larger conferences, symposia, and workshops sometimes. And one of the more recent things to do is we're trying to support reading groups and interest groups. So in fact, if you have a book you'd like to read with colleagues or an interest in the area of mind, brain, and culture, let us know, and we'd like to support you getting together and talking it out. I would like to point your direction to direct you to our website. In particular, our archive of previous lectures, such as this one. We're basically recording everything as you heard. This is a searchable database going back years, so it's a great resource for teaching, personal interest. I encourage you to visit our website and check it out. Just an example of some of the range of programming we do, like these lectures. We've been screening films, having discussion lunches, having hybrid meetings between Emory and Keio University in Tokyo, basically trying to do a bunch of different things. I mentioned that we support these workshops, conferences, and symposia. This spring, we're going to be having the Cognitive Science of Compassion workshop in May to tie into the broader Year of Compassion that Emory University is doing. One of our advisory committee members is heavily involved in this, and including the Compassion exhibit at the Carlos Museum, so I would encourage you to go visit that. If you're a graduate student, you have graduate students who would like to participate with the center, we have a certificate program. Basically, you get together with a cohort of like-minded students who are interested in interdisciplinarity. You take a core course that I usually teach. We supervise your selection of a few electives outside your home department. You became eligible for small amounts of support from the center, but the most important thing is you participate in the life of the center, the programming, things like this, and the promotion of interdisciplinarity. So if you have any interest in that, please check that out. Here are some of you can see our current students come from everything from English to neuroscience to biological anthropology, business, philosophy. So I don't know, it's a really stimulating community to join. We also just put out our call for undergraduate research fellows for next year. This would be the final year undergraduates who are doing some form of research, often an honors project. So look for that on our website if you didn't receive it as an email, and applications are open for next year. If you found out about this lecture in any way other than receiving an email from us, please use the QR code to sign up as an affiliate of the center so you'll receive our communications and never be left in the dark. So that's who we are, but I know you're actually here to see Dr. Krupenye's lecture. Dr. Krupenye is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. He does really cool research at the intersection of comparative psychology, cognitive science, evolutionary anthropology, so exactly the kind of thing that the center exists to promote. His work addresses fundamental questions about how humans and other apes understand thoughts, intentions, beliefs, the minds of others, what's commonly called theory of mind, as well as how they plan for the future and draw upon past experience, sometimes called mental time travel. I think maybe he'll talk about a little bit today how these things might be related to each other. At least we talked about that earlier in the day, and I found that to be very interesting. Hopefully we'll also hear about some of his innovative experimental approaches, such as the use of eye tracking to assess social cognition. He has a really impressive record of grant support and publication in high impact journals you may have heard of, like Science and Current Biology, PNAS, Proceedings B, Trends in Cognitive Science, and more. And in 2025, he was awarded the Early Career Investigator Award from the Society for Behavioral Neuroscience and Comparative Psychology. So we're very honored and privileged to have Chris here to speak with us today, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. So please welcome me in joining him. Join me in welcoming him.
First, I just want to thank Dietz for that very kind introduction. And to thank him, Ben, Rob, Tamara, Leslie, everyone who helped to bring me here and has made this such a lovely day. I've said this to some of you, but I've been reading the work coming out of this institution for my entire career. I'm very enamored of the community that you have here. And so it's just been super lovely to have a rich diversity of conversations with people across CMBC, psychology, anthropology, Yerkes. It's been a phenomenal day. So today I'm going to be talking about the social minds of humans and other apes. But before I jump into that, I just want to mention that I'm an assistant professor of psychological and brain sciences at Hopkins, and my lab studies how animals think and what makes the human mind unique. We have active research streams on humans and also pet dogs. But today, the focus of my talk is going to be on our work with great apes. Okay, so let's start with some facial expressions I'm hoping not to see in the audience today. Okay, so actually I'm showing you this picture because I think it highlights something really fascinating about humans. It's a static image, and yet we're immediately drawn in, and we can barely help but extract all kinds of social information from this image. So there's information about cultural context or group membership, information about social relationships. You might be imagining what these people are looking at, and you might even feel something in response to their emotional expressions. This is all central to what it means to be human. We are a deeply social species with rich cognitive capacities for reasoning about and navigating a complex social world. But of course, the social world presents us with immense complexity and variability, imposing a major challenge for our minds for tracking social information, predicting behavior, and making strategic decisions. So how do we do it? My research investigates the nature and origins of the cognitive mechanisms that allow us to navigate our social worlds. And I'm also interested in what in these capacities makes us unique. This question is challenging, but also particularly interesting because we're not the only species that faces a demanding social environment. The same is true for humans' two closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, who live in large multi-male, multi-female societies comprised of dozens and sometimes even hundreds of familiar individuals. Those of you, since you have a chimpanzee expert here, may be familiar with this. So, for example, apes need to build individualized social relationships, which they do through activities like grooming. In this gesture, that chimpanzee communicated where he wanted to be groomed. And as they strive for high-ranking positions in their dominance hierarchies, chimpanzees, but also bonobos, cooperate with one another in aggressive conflicts, providing coalitionary support to their allies. And they also cooperate in many other ways. So perhaps most notably, chimpanzee communities maintain territories, but they're highly xenophobic. So as you'll see here, chimpanzees notoriously patrol the borders of their territory, carefully coordinating their actions with their group mates and listening for neighboring groups. And this cooperation is critical because these intergroup encounters are potentially very dangerous. If one group encounters another and one group strongly outnumbers the other, they're likely to try to attack and kill their rivals. So here you can see a group of chimpanzees terrified, reassuring each other before a potentially lethal intergroup conflict. Now, bonobos, our other closest relative, on the other hand, have never been observed engaging in lethal intergroup aggression. And they seem to be markedly more tolerant in this particular respect. So here, in quite stunning contrast, we see three bonobo communities, wild bonobo communities, sitting together in the same tree. So in some ways, these species offer radically different perspectives on the origins of human society. That said, for the purposes of the present talk, I'll be mainly focusing on cognitive commonalities that highlight rich shared foundations of human cognition. Okay, so I hope that I've already convinced you to some extent that humans' closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, are fascinating creatures worthy of study on their own. But from a theoretical perspective, these species are also uniquely positioned to shed light on two fundamental issues in the evolutionary and cognitive sciences. So why should we study great apes? The first reason is about evolution. I'm interested in what makes human social cognition unique. So how is it that we alone came to have institutions and teaching and special forms of culture? And by comparing the social cognitive abilities of humans and other apes, we can determine which features of our social minds are shared and were likely present 6 to 9 million years ago in our common evolutionary ancestors. And we can also identify the key features that set us apart that evolved independently since our lineage diverged from theirs. The second is about understanding the cognitive mechanisms themselves, and specifically about separating out the role of language and culture. So, for example, researchers have found that the development of perspective taking is predicted by language achievements, leading some to argue that language is a prerequisite for these forms of thought. Other work finds that social cognitive development can vary across cultures, leading others to argue that these skills are learned through enculturation. But in humans, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to entirely disentangle these processes. However, because apes have minds that are in many ways very similar to our own, they offer an opportunity to examine what the foundations, how the foundations of our cognition work in the absence of patterning by language and culture. Okay, so apes are important for understanding both the evolution of human cognition and how that cognition works. And as I showed you, chimpanzees and bonobos experience a rich social world and exhibit all kinds of complex social behaviors. So with cognitive mechanisms in mind, we can't help but ask, how do apes accomplish this rich diversity of social behaviors? So I want to start by considering an interesting observation that invites a few different possibilities. So what we'll see is several chimpanzees that are using stone tools to crack open nuts. And then there's a social interaction that happens. So the young male is cracking open nuts to access high-value foods using stone tools. Mom arrives, there are no free tools. So she grooms her son instead, which is an affiliative behavior. For a while, he keeps nut cracking. But then she stops and seems to expect her son to reciprocate the grooming, which he does. And she takes the opportunity to steal his tools. So, you know, maybe not a candidate for Parent of the Year, but this is an interesting anecdote, right? And it invites us to ask, to think about what might be going on in these animals' minds. So on the one hand, this mother might have intentionally planned this interaction. She might have deceived her son by considering his perspective. Maybe she anticipated that he's going to turn around and the tools will be out of view. He will not be able to see them at least long enough for her to snatch them away from him. Or on the other hand, this could have been entirely incidental. It's also possible that she showed up she had the intention of, cracking open nuts. The tools weren't available. She opted for the next best thing, which is hanging out with her son, affiliating with him. And then before she knew it, a tool basically fell in her lap and she had no choice but to take it. So these rich observations can inspire hypotheses about what's going on in these animals' minds, hypotheses that we can then test in controlled experiments. So the bulk of my talk today is going to focus on the experimental work we've done to try to disentangle these possibilities. So apes clearly perceptually experience a dynamic social world. And of course, they respond to this environment often in adaptive ways, making decisions about where to travel, whom to befriend, whom to support, and how to behave in diverse contexts. But the critical question is, are they just responding somewhat reflexively to the world around them, or are they making strategic decisions that depend on stores of rich information about their social world? Put another way, apes experience a rich perceptual world when their eyes and ears are open, but what is left when they close their eyes? What store of social knowledge do they possess as mental representations that allows them to predict, reason about, and navigate their social world? This is one of the guiding questions in my lab, and for the remainder of the talk, I will survey several findings that suggest a wealth of social knowledge. So we'll start with social memory. The ability to discriminate individuals and remember them is the foundation of social knowledge. And in the first study, I'll show you that apes have long-lasting memories of familiar social agents. So this seemed to us like it must be the case, in part from personal experience. So when you travel, except for Emory, not very many places have the luxury of having these animals present on their own campus or their own facilities. So for the most part, we travel to different locations to work with great apes. And you're there for some period of time, and then you go away and you come back later to do more experiments. So my lab mostly works with zoos and sanctuaries. And we have the experience that you go back to a place that you haven't been in maybe multiple years, and some of the animals, who are, for example, at a zoo where they typically ignore the visitors, come running over and they want to interact with you and they engage with you in a way that feels like they must remember you. So we had the feeling that it must be the case that they're remembering social partners over long stretches of time. But that is an empirical question that we needed to establish with evidence. And so in this study, my first PhD student, mentee Laura Lewis, who's pictured here, she performed an eye tracking experiment with chimpanzees and bonobos across several zoos to test their social memory capacities. So as you can see in this photo of our setup at Edinburgh Zoo, the apes can choose to enter the testing space and drink juice, and this situates them in the perfect location for us to present images or videos on the monitor while non-invasively recording their gaze and mapping it onto the screen, and also changes in pupil dilation. So this technique allowed us to ask exciting questions in very simple ways. So in this particular experiment, all the apes saw were these side-by-side images of the faces of two members of their species. They were sex matched, so two males or two females, but they differed in one critical way. So one of those individuals was a complete stranger to them, and the other one was an individual who was a former groupmate, somebody who had lived in their group for years, but either died or was transferred to another facility years before. And so our prediction was, if apes remember those familiar groupmates, we should see a bias in their looking toward those individuals. If they don't recognize them, they should just scan the two equally as though they're both strangers. But if they remember them, we should see more attention toward the former groupmate, in the same way that you might if you chanced on someone on the street that you hadn't seen in many years. And this is exactly what we found in both chimpanzees and bonobos. So here you'll see the looking bias represented on the y-axis as a raw difference score between attention to the former groupmate minus attention to the stranger. So higher values reflect more looking to the former groupmate, And what we find is that even in our brief 3-second trials, we find a significant overall bias in attention toward the former groupmate over the stranger, reflecting roughly 11% attention, more attention toward the groupmate. Interestingly, this recognition effect seems to be largely driven by the more research experienced apes at Kumamoto Sanctuary, but that includes a group of chimps and bonobos. Now, I want to show you one particularly exciting data point. So this data point is Louise, a bonobo, viewing former groupmates Loretta and Erin. You can see that the looking bias is very strong, well above the dotted line of model averages, which themselves are already indicative of a significant bias. But the interesting thing is that we collected these data in 2019, and these bonobos last saw each other in 1992. So this is evidence that for over 25 years, these animals still maintain some kind of memory of these important former social partners. And we should keep in mind that apes often only live into their 30s or 40s or 50s. So as far as we can opportunistically assess, we find evidence that they're remembering past social partners. Okay, so this graph and our first set of analyses were aimed at just assessing whether or not they appeared to recognize former groupmates or distinguish groupmates from strangers. But we also wanted to know whether their memory is more nuanced than that. Does it capture some information about the identity or the quality of the past relationship? As you might imagine, just clarification questions. Yeah, we can circle back to it. Thanks. Yeah, I just want to make sure that I get through. There's a lot of fun studies to show you guys. Okay, so right, we wanted to know whether they are able to track anything more about the identities of these individuals. And as you might imagine, we didn't, across 3 facilities, have observational data going back decades to quantify those relationships. But what we did have was access to caretakers who knew all of our subjects at the time when they were still co-housed with their former groupmates. And so we asked those individuals to fill out a questionnaire and rate the quality of the relationship between our subject and our former groupmates at the time when they were last co-housed in terms of the degree of sort of positiveness, rates of positive interaction, rates of negative interaction, and relative dominance. And one thing I can say is that at least in this metric, we had high inter-rater reliability. So it was completed independently by multiple raters, and they agreed on the sort of nature of these relationships. Interestingly, we found that just one of those relationship features was predictive of looking bias. So as in the other graph, looking bias is plotted here on the y-axis with higher values indicating more attention to the former groupmate. And on the x-axis, we have ratings of positive interaction rates with the most positive relationships on the left. So I want to be careful not to overinterpret this effect because it's not overwhelming, but what we found was that apes showed significantly greater attention toward former groupmates with whom they previously had the most positive relationships. So we have tentative evidence that apes' memory is capturing continuous information about relationship quality, or at least the aggregate positiveness of their interaction history. And perhaps that they're treating these as individuals, not just some class of familiar or unfamiliar. So this work suggests that in some meaningful sense, apes' lives are not entirely confined to the present. They retain information about long-term social partners for many years beyond their interactions. And excitingly, this finding was recently replicated by Ikuma Adachi's lab at Kyoto University. Next, I'll argue that apes also mentally represent or keep in mind the whereabouts of familiar individuals in their immediate vicinity. Chimpanzees and bonobos, for the most part, range in dense forests where groupmates can easily go out of view. So it would make sense if they were holding in mind in some way the locations of the individuals that they're ranging with, just in the same way that you might have a sort of mental sense of where in your house your roommates or family members are. So this work was done by one of the first PhD students in my group, Luz Carvajal. Across 5 studies, Luz tested the capacity of bonobo Kanzi to track the locations of multiple familiar agents. Kanzi watched as 2 caretakers were hidden behind giant barriers, and he needed to figure out or tell us where he thought particular individuals were. So first he sees them go behind the 2 barriers, but at this point he doesn't know which person he's going to be asked to find. So he has to track both of them. Once the caretakers are hidden behind the barriers, Luz showed him a photo prompt telling him which individual he needed to point toward. And it was his job to point to the barrier that contained that individual. So I'm going to show you an example of what one of those trials looked like. This view on the left is just showing you Kanzi and his pointing. On the right, we see a sort of bird's eye view of the setup. This is Luz, who's going to be sort of leading the experiment. And then you have the 2 caretakers that he will need to track. And you can see a little bit of the middle barrier. There's a further barrier to the right of that and another one to the left. So the first thing that happens is each of the experimenters stations themselves briefly in front of one of the barriers, and then we'll go behind the barriers. All right, so now they're going behind their barriers, and then Luz is going to show a photo prompt. Kanzi always points to the picture, and then when the picture goes down, he points to the location, in this case to Sarah, who's here. So across several studies, Kanzi consistently pointed above chance to the location where the prompted individual was hidden. For example, in the first study that I've just shown you, he was correct on 35 out of 60 trials, well above a chance probability of 1/3. The claim we wanted to make was that Kanzi was concurrently tracking the locations of multiple individuals, but also keeping their identities straight, so that he actually knew who was in which location. But we were also aware that Kanzi might rely on some lower level heuristics to try to solve this task, like maybe tracking the location of one individual and then choosing randomly if the other individual was prompted. But critically, each of those alternative strategies predicts a quite precise pattern of errors. And so we were able to look at we were able to compare his performance with each of those strategies, and we didn't find any evidence that he was using any of these lower level alternatives. In a second experiment, we controlled for the possibility that he was just tracking where he last saw someone as opposed to mentally representing them as being in that location. And so the way we did that was we had him watch these 2 individuals hide behind different barriers, and then each of the barriers were moved. So it was an invisible displacement or hidden displacement situation. And here again, he was able to identify, indicate the person's location above chance. And next we asked whether he could use auditory information. And so in a third experiment, there's only 2 barriers. The 2 people hide behind different barriers, but Kanzi doesn't get to see where they go. And then he hears their voices from the different locations and then sees the photo prompt. And here he was able to identify the correct location on the basis of the voices. So Kanzi's ability to locate individuals using either visual or auditory signatures of identity suggests that apes track the location of these individuals even when they're hidden outside of perceptual access. And it also reinforces work by Rob Hampton and others suggesting that primates possess cross-modal representations of familiar individuals. So next I'll argue that apes also track information about the dispositions of other agents. So across a handful of studies that Brian Hare and I did, we showed bonobos third-party interactions between novel agents and then allowed them to choose between these agents. In some studies, they viewed simple animated agents interacting and then could choose between paper cutouts of the helper or the hinderer. So for example, they would watch videos like the ones I'm about to show you that were modeled off of studies in developmental psychology. So you have a neutral character that's trying but failing to climb a hill. And then in this case, they encounter a helper, a nice guy. but that's not always the case. Sometimes their goals are thwarted. And in other experiments, bonobos observed unfamiliar human social partners engage in similar kinds of third-party interaction. So, for example, a helper human would attempt to retrieve a toy that another individual had dropped, but then a third hinderer would sort of snatch it away. And then the bonobos could choose to take food from the helper or the hinderer. Excitingly, we found across all three studies that adult bonobos did pay attention. They reliably seemed to track the agent's behavior, and they showed consistent preferences and no preferences in various controls, but they did not like the helper. Unlike humans, we find that bonobos reliably preferred hinderers over helpers. We think because they see those individuals as dominant. And in a fourth study, we confirmed that in similar kind of methods, they have a preference for a dominant individual over a subordinate. Okay, so these findings suggest that apes are paying close attention to their social worlds, to third-party interactions that don't necessarily involve them. They seem to extract information about others' behavior and dispositions from those observations, and they use that information later to inform their own social decisions. Okay, finally, in the longest section of the talk, I'm going to argue that apes also track rich information related to others' perspectives, minds, and mental states. So they try to figure out what others are thinking. So humans are reasonably good at understanding and predicting others' behavior because we're not only paying attention to others' behavior. So we're also considering the unobservable mental causes for someone's behavior. So if you see someone pulling up the cushions of the couch, you can make some quick inferences that help you to understand their perspective and explain their behavior. Most likely, they're searching for something, maybe the television remote or their cell phone that they believe is located within the couch. This capacity is what we call theory of mind, and importantly, it even allows us to track beliefs that differ from our own. So we can infer that this man believes that his cell phone is within the couch, even if we observe it and know that it is on a nightstand, a side table nearby, for example. So by tracking an agent's mental states, like goals and beliefs, we can anticipate and explain their behavior, even when their view of the world differs from our own. And we can also effectively coordinate or deceive on the basis of this kind of information. So the study of theory of mind formally began 50 years ago with a 1978 behavioral and brain sciences paper that asked this very question. The paper marked the launch of an entire subfield of cognitive science, which has produced thousands of works in developmental psychology, philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and comparative cognition. And it's widely accepted that children, of course, at some point develop theory of mind, that there, many have argued that there's even a theory of mind network in the human brain. But the question of whether any animal possesses a theory of mind remains contentious. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to speak about several lines of evidence that we've accumulated related to this question about whether apes have a theory of mind. And then I'll talk a little bit about a philosophical challenge to this research framework and a possible route forward. Okay, so the first line of evidence. In humans, theory of mind depends on a sensitivity to extremely nuanced cues of others' attention and awareness. Much past work suggests that apes clearly attend to coarse cues related to others' perspective, like the direction of their bodies or faces. But evidence is much thinner for the question of whether they're attending to more nuanced cues, like what's going on with someone's eyes. So we decided to dig into this further in a new experiment. So here, PhD student Luke Townrow and I took advantage of a very sweet and fun-loving behavior from our gregarious bonobo cousins, which is that they try to scare the crap out of you when you're not paying attention. So this lovely behavior provided an opportunity for us to test what social cues they're sensitive to when they try to startle a human partner. So in the first experiment, we tested their sensitivity to body orientation. So the experimenter stood, as you can see here, either facing a window with the bonobos on the other side or with their back turned, and we counterbalanced the order of those kinds of trials across sessions. So here's what it looks like. This is Luke. In this particular case, he's facing forward first, and we'll see what happens when he turns around. Luke likes to say that this experiment took years off of his life. It's a bit stressful, not knowing when they're going to get you. Okay, so here's the full set of data showing you the proportion of trials in which the bonobos hit the window. And what we can see is that there's sort of this dramatic tendency to hit the window much more when the back is turned than when you're facing forward. Next, we asked if bonobos are sensitive to that more nuanced cue. So if the experimenter is looking forward or facing forward toward them, will they pay attention to whether the experimenter's eyes are open or closed? So here's the data from the first experiment that I just showed you, and here's the data from the second experiment. So as you can see, when they're motivated to exploit another's perspective, bonobos were highly sensitive to whether the experimenter's eyes were open or closed. This is important because it shows that apes are not only relying on really coarse body or facial cues, they're sensitive to more nuanced cues to others' attention. Okay, so the second line of evidence. Since the 1978 BBS paper, there have been ongoing debates about what should constitute evidence for theory of mind. So one of the things that came out of that 1978 paper was a proposal generated independently in 3 of the commentaries by Bennett, Dennett, and Harmon. What would be diagnostic of theory of mind, they argued, would be if a subject could truly understand when someone else had a view of the world that differed from the subject's own. And from this, the most popular task in the theory of mind literature was born, called the false belief test. So in classic verbal false belief tests, children witness an actor hide an object in a particular location. While the actor is away, the object is moved. And then when the actor returns, children are asked to predict where she will search for the hidden object. If they appreciate that she has a false belief, they should predict that she's going to search for the object where she last saw it, where she believes it is, even though the children by now know that it's no longer in that location. So the goal of our next study was to implement this kind of paradigm with grade 8s. Of course, one challenge is how to measure the predictions of a nonverbal creature. So in our work, we exploited a novel nonverbal measure of individuals' predictions that was being used in developmental psychology. It's called anticipatory looking. So if you were to watch me reach for a glass, many of you would look to the glass even before I grasp it, visually anticipating the outcome of that behavior. And so what that means is under controlled settings, your looking can be used as a measure of your predictions. So we tested a large sample of apes in Germany and Japan. They sip juice and watch videos on a monitor. For the most part, that looks like this, although sometimes a little reshuffling is necessary. Now, apes aren't as into dolls or puppets as children are, so we had to lean into what they do care about, which is drama. So we embedded our false belief scenarios into conflicts between a human and a costumed bad guy. So our first study involved 2 experiments that each included 2 conditions that controlled for different low-level explanations. And I'm going to show you an example of what the false belief manipulation looked like in one of the conditions of our second study. So this chimpanzee is watching this video, and the red dots will tell you at any point where she is looking. So we have to start with our requisite drama. So the green guy has a goal of retrieving the stone and watches it being hidden in the left location in this particular case. Then what happens is the stone is moved and ultimately removed. And what we have now is a situation where the human outside of the room now falsely believes that the stone remains in this left location. And what we want to know is when that person returns to the scene and starts reaching ambiguously between the two locations, do apes look to a particular location in anticipation of the actor's reach? And what we find in these two experiments and subsequent follow-ups is that apes look first to the location where the actor believes that the object is located, so the target location, anticipating the target of his search. So we find that they're able to predict the behavior of an agent with a false belief. Excitingly, this study has also been replicated in monkeys, and we recently replicated it in human adults too. So the third line of evidence, yeah. Yes, please.
Match, you also manipulate order, maybe in terms of sort of low-level cues that would account for maybe a bias towards something they
That's right.
Or primacy or recency effect, like
yes.
What were some of those?
Yeah, so we across the different conditions, we control for whether the target location is the first or the last location where the object was hidden. It doesn't matter. No, yeah, and timing. Those kinds of things are accounted for as best we can. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the false belief test is, of course, not the only way to test for theory of mind, and in fact has had something of a fall from grace as soon as human infants and non-human animals have started to pass those kinds of tests. So another important view comes from Phillips and Norby, who argue that there are two essential features of a capacity for theory of mind. So one is, of course, the subject must be able to track another agent's understanding of the world. But two, she must also be able to keep her own representation of reality separate. So the functional prediction is that you should expect another agent to act on whatever understanding of the world you've attributed to them, but at the same time, you as the subject should act on your own representation of reality when given the opportunity. So we looked for evidence of these two criteria in a newly published study, again by PhD student Luke Townrow. So in line with this proposal, we focused on whether bonobos could represent that a cooperative human partner was knowledgeable or ignorant about the location of a hidden food. And we also wanted to know whether the subject at the same time maintained an accurate representation of where that food was located. So the way the task works is the bonobo sits across from their cooperative partner, E1, at a table where there are 3 cups, and the second experimenter, E2, will hide one piece of food in one of those cups. And what we varied was whether the partner was ignorant or knowledgeable of the food's ultimate location. So while the food was being hidden, the partner was either behind an opaque barrier and therefore was ignorant of the food's location, or they were behind a windowed barrier and therefore could observe the hiding and were knowledgeable. Next, the barriers were removed, and the table was slid toward the human partner, whose job it was to search for the food. And if the human partner could find the food, the bonobo would get the food. But in these test trials, the human partner would sort of waver for 10 seconds. And what the prediction was if the bonobos could discriminate when their partner was ignorant versus knowledgeable, they should point more, they should communicate more proactively about the food's location when their partner was ignorant. So here's a video of one trial in which the partner E1 is ignorant of the food's location. We've got our bonobo, our 3 cups. E1 is behind the table. So the barrier is going in front of E1, who will be ignorant as the food is hidden. Okay, so the E2 is baiting the food in one location. And then we'll take the barrier away and slide the table toward E1. And you should just look closely at the bonobo's behavior. So that is 1 point.
And the second point.
So we had 3 subjects in this study, and what we found is that all 3 of them, to varying degrees, but a consistent pattern that's significant in 2 of them, spontaneously pointed and did so more often when their partner was ignorant in the light blue trials than when he was knowledgeable in the dark blue trials. They also pointed more quickly on the light blue ignorance trials than on the dark blue knowledge trials. So I take these data to mean that bonobos fulfill Phillips and Norby's first feature. The fact that they communicate more proactively when their partner is ignorant suggests that they can track knowledge and ignorance. And as it turns out, when they do point on either kind of condition, they point reliably to the correct location. So they maintain an accurate representation of the food's location. So this is all lovely evidence that apes seem to have theory of mind, but there is one problem. There's at least one big challenge to this body of work, to all work on nonverbal approaches to theory of mind. And the issue at hand is whether subjects are really tracking mental content or only behavior. So the mind reading hypothesis argues that in these kind of contexts, the subject observes a behavior, like an agent glancing towards food. They impute a mental state that that agent can see the food, for example. And from that mental state, they generate a prediction of the agent's behavior. So the agent will approach the food. But there's an alternative, which is called behavior reading, which is that you observe the first behavior, the agent glances toward the food. Maybe from your life experience, from the statistical regularities you've observed in the social world, you can already predict that agents that glance toward food are likely to approach that food. So you might be able to predict the behavior without imputing the mental state. And if that kind of prediction is our measure of theory of mind, the logical problem says that it's impossible to tell whether what we're seeing is mind reading or behavior reading. One empirical solution has been proposed by Celia Hayes and endorsed by Krupenye. To control for this sort of behavior reading, Hayes suggested that participants be tested in situations where an agent's view is obscured by a novel blindfold, and it could be opaque or see-through, but you only know that once you try it on. So participants can only determine whether the agent wearing the blindfold can see or not by projecting their own mental experience of seeing or not seeing through that blindfold. I don't have time to go into the details of these studies, but we and others have shown that apes can pass variants of this experience projection paradigm. So there is some evidence against the behavior reading account. However, as you might expect, while this general paradigm has been pushed even by some theory of mind skeptics, philosophers have put forward alternative explanations. So for example, Lurs argued that maybe subjects are not learning about the mental content that's associated with the barrier or the blindfold, but are just learning whether it is, they're learning about the occlusive properties of the blindfold, like whether it is a barrier or not. And then they can sort of build that into their model, their behavior reading model. So if this is right, and if there is really this intractable logical problem of mind reading, then we need other approaches to adjudicate these hypotheses. So I'm just going to quickly, in the last few minutes, tell you about another approach that we've started to implement empirically and for which I'm currently trying to write up the theoretical paper. So in this paper, I'm proposing a building blocks approach. So if there is indeed this logical problem of mind reading, then just continuing to test for mind reading isn't going to clear up whether we're measuring mind reading or behavior reading. So I think we need better ways to tell these hypotheses apart. So on the basis of new lines of evidence, and specifically, I think we should look for converging evidence that animals possess the requisite cognitive and representational mechanisms that are fundamental to theory of mind. So the approach is to work out more precise models of theory of mind and the representational machinery that undergirds it, to test for these representations in theory of mind experiments, but also see converging evidence of these representations in other cognitive domains. And the benefits are that this approach provides a proof of principle that that kind of representational machinery is within the cognitive toolkit of the animal, and in principle could be available for theory of mind. But also, many of these capacities are predicted by the mind reading account, but not by the behavior reading account. Now, there are many relevant representational resources like abstract conceptual representations, causal models, and so on. But I'll just give you one example of where we started with this approach. We've begun by looking for other evidence of secondary representations. So this secondary representations involve an ability to hold in mind and keep straight multiple models of the world. So these are representations of alternate states that are decoupled from our primary representations of reality. They're a cognitive underpinning of meta-representation, and they're critical for theory of mind. So for example, you need secondary representations to at once hold in mind someone else's view of the world and also keep it separate from your own. But they're also necessary for other cognitive abilities like pretense, where, for example, you need to track pretend or imaginary content and keep that separate from your representation of reality. And they're not relevant for behavior reading. So we started with this question of pretense. Interestingly, across a number of decades, a pretty large number of papers on captive and wild apes have reported anecdotal observations of apes doing things that look like pretending. So, for example, wild chimpanzees carrying around sticks or logs as though they were babies, or dolls. Captive bonobos appearing to pretend to eat blueberries off of a picture. But of course, these anecdotes are all vulnerable to alternative explanations. And surprisingly, the literature did not contain a single controlled experiment. So former postdoc Amalia Bastos and I decided to run an experiment. And the way we began to study pretense in apes was to test the lexigram-trained bonobo Kanzi on his understanding of imaginary or pretend objects. So we designed a paradigm based around work with human children. So what happens is the bonobo sits across from the human experimenter, who places two empty transparent cups on the table and then takes an empty transparent pitcher and tips it over each of the cups as if to fill them with pretend juice, and then picks up one of those cups and dumps it back into the pitcher, and then pushes the table forward and asks Kanzi, where is the juice? So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so one of them is going to be dumped back out, leaving only one cup with imaginary juice. The experimenter asks, where's the juice? And in this study, we found strikingly that Kanzi was above chance in indicating the location that still contained imaginary juice.
Just how is it to know where's the juice?
So this animal has like a lifetime of experience where he's kind of acquired some, we don't know exactly what he understands in spoken English, but he was responsive to all kinds of verbal prompts. Yeah, exactly. So he unfortunately passed away. He was kind of remarkable, like a year ago. He was really a remarkable animal and allowed us to get inroads into this kind of question, to basically ask it exactly the same way you would with children, where you use verbal prompts. Yes. What's that? As opposed to? Yeah.
Like color, right? So it's not that step above.
Yeah.
That you're arguing for. Right?
So yeah, I mean, our intuition is that, these are empty cups. He has a lot of familiarity with them. So he should understand that they're indeed empty. But of course, you might wonder, like, did he just think that the cups really contained real juice? And so the way that we addressed that was in a control condition where he had a choice between a cup containing real juice and a cup containing pretend juice. And here the prompt was a little bit different. We asked him, "What do you want, Kanzi?" And he's no dummy. He knows that imaginary juice doesn't taste very good. So he very consistently preferred, chose the real juice over the imaginary juice. That's as directly as we could address that alternative explanation. And then, we wanted to know, okay, is this sort of robust? Is there some flexibility to this ability? So we did a conceptual replication with a bit different kind of paradigm where we asked if he could identify the location of pretend grapes, and he was able to do that as well. So if Kanzi is really tracking imaginary objects and keeping them straight from his primary representation of reality, this is evidence that he can generate these decoupled representations and hold in mind multiple models of the world, capacities that are fundamental to theory of mind, but critically that are not required for behavior reading. So in my view, this kind of evidence strongly favors the mind reading hypothesis over the behavior reading hypothesis, even though the task itself does not necessarily require mind reading. I should be clear about that. Okay, so to recap the theory of mind section of the talk, I've shown you first that apes are sensitive to nuanced cues to others' attention, like whether their eyes are open or closed, that they can pass a false belief test, and that there's reason to think that they track others' states and keep them separate from their own. I outlined the logical problem of mind reading and provided converging evidence of secondary representations that are a key building block of theory of mind. Okay, and so returning to the broader issue at hand, what I've argued is that even when apes close their eyes, much of the rich external world continues on in their minds. They have enduring representations of familiar partners. They mentally represent the whereabouts of these individuals and track their dispositions, and they even are sensitive to others' perspectives. All of this information allows them to predict behavior and to determine how to strategically interact. I'd also argue that demonstrating these capacities, that these capacities are within the cognitive potential of our closest relatives, suggests two things of major theoretical significance about human cognition. So first, the fact that these capacities are shared makes it very likely that they are evolutionarily ancient aspects of human cognition that were present at least 6 to 9 million years ago in our common ancestor. And second, regarding debates about the relationship between language and thought, our findings suggest that each of these capacities evolved before the evolution of natural language, and each of these capacities can in principle operate in the absence of natural language. So what then makes human social cognition unique? One thing that I'll point to that I think defines humans is that we have a much richer capacity and motivation to share our thoughts and the content of our minds with others, a capacity which is supported in part by language, at least in language's ability to transmit all kinds of information seamlessly from one mind to another. Okay, in the final minute that I'm going over time, I would like to tell you about some ongoing and future directions that I'm very excited about. So first, in our work on theory of mind, we're now asking whether apes have a causal model of others' minds, and drawing on philosophical work of Kristen Andrews, we're investigating whether they can use their theory of mind not just to predict, but also to explain others' behavior. And this line of work, which is funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, will ask more broadly whether animals seek explanations about unexpected events in the world around them. Second, influenced by the work of Franz de Waal and others, suggesting that apes are attending not just to the behavior of single individuals, as in most of the experiments I've shown you today. We're asking whether what apes know about the broader social landscape within their groups. So to what extent are they tracking third-party relationships like dominance and alliances, and what representations support that social knowledge? We're also asking how apes represent their social groups and the groups of outgroup individuals, thanks to another grant from the Templeton World Charity Foundation. And finally, if apes indeed are engaging in a primitive form of politics, then they need an ability to simulate and plan for possible futures, and presumably episodic memory and a capacity to reason about time. So in a future line of work, we're also examining these cognitive building blocks of social strategy and designing experiments capable of addressing philosophical challenges to existing data. This work will continue to clarify what makes us human and how we came to be. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to thank my collaborators, mentors, mentees, the Apes, the many institutions that have partnered with us, the funders, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Great.
So I guess I have a two-parter. The first is that with respect to theory of mind and false belief in particular, there are at least some folks who believe that pre-verbal children can do that, as you acknowledged. And so I guess I'm just wondering with respect to that, what the work with chimpanzees and bonobos with the non-human primates is adding. Didn't we already know that there's some form of theory of mind that doesn't depend on language, or do you think that there are particular things that language could, in principle, buy you over and above those maybe more simplistic representations that support looking time differences, for example?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if you, in terms of the question of like the relationship between language and various forms of thought, pre-verbal infants are sort of like a soft test because they will develop language. There might be some sort of, there's a language acquisition device, or there's there are things that are sort of brewing in them that will eventually become language, and so that's something emerges before, as I think useful, but it's not fully diagnostic of the ability of that thing to function
entirely in the absence of,
there might be some shared machinery that's there that hasn't fully come online in the case of language. I think the apes provide, or animals in general provide a stronger test. If the view is that natural language is unique to humans, they don't have it. So I think that's what I would say. But then, of course, there are multiple reasons to study apes, right? You might be interested in evolutionary origins. You might be interested in like what precursors exist in evolutionary, what are the foundations of human cognition that are built on by in humans. If you go to that sort of 6 to 9 million year ago starting point, what was the basis? What have you added, right? And then also, I think developmentally, sort of that's another thing that could have evolved, right? Shifts in the development. We know that children have these really long childhoods. They're sort of, they're built, they're like born in some ways underdeveloped, but in other ways, like, the infant cognition seems to possess sort of, there's evidence of rich knowledge quite early on. And so that's another important question is like, is that the thing that makes us special, that it emerges really early and then develops that much further through our long childhoods? I think we need
comparisons.
Great. So my second part related to language as well is the idea that you may not need language for the pretense. And yet you're studying Kanzi, who had tons of training, symbolic training, right, for communication in particular. So, well, I guess you're going to try to study other chimps or bonobos at some point, right?
Yeah. So I think, at this point, what we have is like the one experimental set of experimental evidence, which comes specifically from Kanzi, as you noted. And right, it is possible that something about Kanzi's linguistic training, or, he also, he had a lot of experience with symbols, which are referring to like, an external, which are a representation of an external entity in some way. There's secondary representations are kind of embedded in that training too. So I think there's three possibilities. One is that kanzi is like other apes, and this is a capacity that they all would have, but it's easier to study it in kanzi because we can communicate with him in ways that
are more similar.
or he can produce communication that is more interpretable to us. Another possibility is that he's like other apes in the sense that they would also have these kind of pretense capacities, but nonetheless, the language training amplified his ability, so he's even more proficient than others might be. And then the third possibility is that it sort of radically transformed how he thinks or the kinds of representations he can entertain. With regard to, so the data that we have that suggests that he might not be special are these diversity of anecdotes. They're only anecdotes, but there's a diversity of anecdotes even in wild apes that don't have anything like his training that might suggest that pretense could be sort of broadly shared in apes. And then we have converging evidence from theory of mind, planning for the future, at least when it comes to things like secondary representations. A whole host of other kinds of apes have been tested on those tasks. And it doesn't seem to be that it's specific to a particular set of training. But for sure, it's an empirical question. And I think it will be really important to find ways of testing that in other apes because, we do want to
pin down sort of
what's going on and to what extent has Kanzi's unique history sort of really transformed the way in which he was thinking. It suggests at least that there's it's within the cognitive potential of apes, but it doesn't answer the question of generalizability and what is sort of typical for apes.
Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned that monkeys also pass the false belief task, or your version of it. And so that was interesting to me because, as you know, apes are much more closely related to us than monkeys, and also apes have much bigger brains than monkeys. So I guess I'm just wondering, what cognitive abilities do apes have that monkeys don't? Or have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that one piece of data is going to go against what I'm about to say. So Laurie Santos thinks that monkeys cannot pass false belief tests. She has several studies using a different violation of expectation method that they have failed. But there is one study from a Japanese group with Japanese macaques where they showed similar behavior and anticipatory looking. But broadly, one of the theoretical papers that I'm currently working on, the other one besides the one I mentioned, is thinking about this kind of question of secondary representations and the ability to hold in mind multiple models of the world, which we use for theory of mind, which we use for thinking about possible futures,
which we use for pretense, and
certain kinds of object permanence. I think we now have a variety of different lines of evidence that this is something that apes are pretty fluent in, that they can pass all those kinds of tasks. As far as I've reviewed the literature so far, the monkeys can pass basically none of those kinds of tasks or are much worse on a lot of those tasks. So I think this ability to sort of think beyond the here and now, to hold in mind and compare multiple representations about the world or possible worlds is something that might have emerged uniquely in apes and might set us apart.
Thanks. Why did we? Sorry.
I was wondering about different type of apes that some of them are observed to have some hierarchical social structures. Some are like one-to-one mating relations, and humans seem to fall in the middle of that. So I was wondering whether the behaviors we see from humans is not defined by the closeness of evolution tree. It might be something that is very unique.
So can you restate your question maybe a little bit? For sure, I agree that there are things that are unique about humans. Is that what you're pushing back on?
It's like people observe some apes about their social structures.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are in a hierarchical structure, like in a tournament style, that the males on the top get the mating rights, and those will below will wait,
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
when it's off the season, and other apes that they might be a one-to-one or close bonding relations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So humans seem to fall between these two kind of groups,
Mhm.
that one is closer to us
Yeah.
evolutionally, and the other one is probably further away. But there's not like a mapping relation that we are closer to the one that's evolutionally closer to us. So is it possible that you can see something better by looking at other species than the great apes?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things that characterizes humans is for sure that we have a high degree of flexibility. There's cultural variation in much of
our behavior too.
I mean, so some people think, for example, right, like pair bonding, chimps and bonobos live in these like big multi-male, multi-female societies. They have a highly promiscuous mating system, which is that exists in principle to confuse paternity, which is to say, like, when a female is receptive, she will mate with many males. And then the hope is that when she has a baby, nobody knows whose baby it is and nobody's going to kill her offspring. But she develops like long-term relationships with many males, and sometimes, her like male friends are the ones that she mates with, but also there's coercion and it's complicated. They're not like pair bonded or monogamous in any meaningful sense. Or not like only pair bonded. Whereas, like the caltrichid monkeys, like the tamarins and marmosets, they do have these pair bonded, two individual, like the male and the female have offspring, and then they're like helpers, and it's a highly cooperative system where the males will carry the offspring. And so, right, I think some people like Judith Burkhardt at the University of Zurich, they study those monkeys because they think there's convergence in that particular way, and there might be certain sort of emotional and cognitive capacities that come that are part of cooperative breeding or pair bonding that we should see in those species that are not visible in apes. So definitely from the perspective, I think we need to study, our closest relatives to ask questions about homology and what things are shared as a result of shared ancestry, and trying to get as close as we can to modeling that common ancestor we had 6 to 9 million years ago. But you're right that there are ways in which other species, there's a lot of work on birds when it comes to vocal communication, right? Because they exhibit, convergently certain kinds of vocal communication that you don't necessarily see in our closest relatives. So I agree that we should take a broader phylogenetic perspective when we're interested in looking at convergent mechanisms.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, have you thought about studying consciousness in apes?
Yeah.
Consciousness is sort of like a taboo subject for people who do controlled experiments. The challenge is that, we don't I don't even really know that any of you are conscious. The primary measure is verbal report. So, I know that I have a mental experience. I have phenomenal experience. I know what it's like to be inside my head and to be the driver of my body. Or what pain feels like or whatever, right? And then I can ask you if you also share that experience. And you will say yes, and then I just sort of take for granted that that it's true. And so when it comes to animals, it's tricky because we cannot sort of measure many of those things directly or like in an unequivocal way. But I do think a lot of the phenomena that we're studying are related to consciousness for sure. So Rob does a lot of work on metacognition, which is, thinking about your own thoughts, having some ability to sort of reflect on your own knowledge. That's also closely tied to theory of mind, the ability to sort of track other individuals' knowledge. I think we have every reason to think that non-human primates
are conscious in many of the ways that humans
are, but it's tricky to it's tricky to pin down. It's one of those topics where we should study it, but we might never know with 100% certainty, that we're studying the same thing. What pain, the signatures of pain are shared, but is the the phenomenal experience of pain identical or the same? We can't know for sure, but there's anyway. So I guess I'm kind of studying consciousness, but I tend not to use the word. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, thanks a lot for the talk. I mean,
You raised so many cool issues.
My question is going to be maybe about
just the kind of perspective you take on some of these things. And so I want
back
to
to
go back to
Luke's
Luke's
experiment.
experiment with the bonobo scaring him when he's looking away. And I think, there's kind of an implicit thing here. You're really
Inviting everybody to
think pretty
extensively about what
that means about the bonobo. That it's taken Luke's perspective. It knows what he knows and what he can know. But there's a long history of research in animal behavior about
the gaze. The gaze is such a powerful thing. Like cats looking at prey. The prey knows that.
You can
scare chickens more with 2 marbles on a stick
than with 1 marble on a stick.
Butterflies that have these fake eyes, right? And those are all cases where you wouldn't at all be likely to take
those same leaps of
interpretation.
So my question is just how do you approach that kind of problem? I think you probably agree. You really
invited us to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's each individual experiment has limits to what you can conclude, right? But the hope is that you're building a body of knowledge that has, if you're taking an approach from parsimony, that there's parsimonious explanation. I think other studies that I haven't done but others have done, for example, shows that when that primates and certainly apes will do various things like they follow others' gaze, right? So if I look up and then you would look up, you can identify the target of my gaze. But it's not just a reflexive behavior. If I look up and there's a barrier here such that you can't actually see what I'm looking at, chimpanzees won't look up. They appreciate that they actually can't see the target of your attention. There's some clever studies that if there's an object here and you turn and express surprise, but the chimp has seen that you've already seen that object, you're already familiar with it, they'll look over there, assuming that you must be directing your attention at something else. This is familiar. Why would you be surprised about it? So I think those kinds of studies suggest to us that yes, of course, there is, some fundamental way in which eyes and faces are, attracted by the primate brain, but it does seem to be the case that maybe it's just a foundation, that there's definitely something richer that's layered onto that. That's what I would argue. There's other studies on, especially more related to body orientation, where the chimps will go to, if somebody has a pile of food and their, back is turned or their front, whatever, the chimps will go to the front before communicating. They'll use more auditory gestures to someone's back and more vocal gestures or clapping behaviors when, the auditory gestures like clapping or vocalizations when the back is turned, right? So I think all of this suggests, right, you can debate whether it amounts to theory of mind, but I think it is indicative of a pretty nuanced sensitivity to the cues that are related to our mental states. Some philosophers call this mind minding. It's possible that they kind of learn to respond as though they know that you have a mind without doing that. That's still, I think, a viable explanation for some of these data, but they're doing, they're ultimately, I think, doing something much more sophisticated than just responding. And monkeys, monkeys see the eyes and then they give you the little, the eyelid, So I think the cue there, I don't know, that's a very salient cue that they respond strongly to, but apes don't freak out when you look at them, so that. And I think the data suggests that they're responding in a
less rigid way. But yeah, thanks.
One more question. Thanks for your talk, Chris. I just had a question broadly about like the behavior reading versus mind reading. So you talked a lot about, you know, for every piece of evidence of mind reading, there's always a behavior reading explanation as well. And, you know, to kind of like account for every single behavior reading or behavior rule, I feel like a lot of the experiments would just be so like bland that no ape would ever like even participate in it. So I was just wondering like how, like your perspective on um, how much like of a behavior reading explanation you're kind of willing to accept within evidence and like of theory of mind, and if it would still be within what you would consider a theory of mind, and sort of like if like you kind of think that maybe behavior reading is more of like a part of a toolkit of theory of mind versus an alternative explanation, like kind of how they connect.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, right, it could certainly be the case that humans with their sort of, you know, Kristen Andrews, for example, has like advocated for pluralistic accounts of social cognition, where she thinks that we can do the effortful perspective taking, but it's probably not what we're doing most of the time. And there might be simpler mechanisms that are, routinely available, especially in these kind of, time intense situations. Or in very familiar situations where you might just have some script like what's going to
happen, and you can predict events that way.
So I think that's entirely possible. These don't necessarily have to be, mutually exclusive. I think, people would historically say these are like two different hypotheses, and different mechanisms. I would have to concede that most of the data cannot distinguish between them. And so, I mean, my thought is that we have convergent evidence, we have evidence from a lot of tasks that are consistent with mind reading, and we have now these sorts of convergent kinds of evidence of, on common representational capacities that I think start to favor. But yeah, I think it's important to be open-minded about these possibilities and continue to test them. But the other thing is like the historical debate has been like these kind of like underspecified mechanisms on this side and that side, and especially with the like advent of all this like computational modeling of cognition, there's been an interest in formalizing hypotheses much more precisely and putting all of your assumptions out in the open. And there's also, especially since the developmental evidence that was mentioned earlier, that infants might be able to do this, there's been this question of like, okay, well, what would be like intermediate forms of something like mind reading that aren't the full-blown thing? And people have come up with really interesting hypotheses that make really precise predictions about what does this mechanism look like and what's its signature limitations, where will it fail relative to the more sophisticated thing. And so I think there's increasingly opportunities to be testing much more precise intermediate hypotheses as opposed to just focusing on the sort of perennial question of like, is it theory of mind or is it not? I think there's room to move forward whether or not we can ever answer that bigger question.
Thank you.